Welcome to you all, and thank you for being part of this dialogue. As you know, this was a program that I was to have brought to China last spring, thanks to the diplomacy of Chen Yi and Zhou Long. But this will be my only performance of it until we're allowed to travel again. We all have in common a Chinese upbringing, whether Chinese born, as several of you are, or as descendants of Chinese born parents. I think it's fair to say that we all experience life through the lens of a mixed identity. China has a 5,000-year musical history with its own principles and practices, its own concept of tuning systems, of beauty, and indigenous instruments dating back to ancient times, but still in use today. You all have such distinctive voices and are very different from each other. For me, a first generation American, you and your music are my windows into the world of everyone up my family tree. I love to tell the story of practicing Ganru's gong movement from the sweet ancient music, which is on the concert. I was practicing it at my parents' home in New Jersey, and it's the one and only time that my father, a civil engineer who taught at CCNY, padded downstairs to listen to me practice and interject a criticism. And he said, "Gloria, it's too fast." I said, "Really? What do you mean?" He said, "It has to sound like the bells being played in the temple on the hilltops and resounding through the valleys. It's too fast." So that comment changed my concept of the piece, and it actually changed many things about the way I think about music and resonance and space. So I love that story. And now I'd like to turn it over to you to ask, what is the role that your Chinese identity and your Chinese soul shape your music? Do you feel a fluidity between the two cultures that you inhabit? Or how does a dual experience of the world inspire your music? Maybe we could start with Ganru, who was the
Okay.
first in 1983 of a wave of young composers to come to study at Columbia University, invited by Zhou Song. So Ganru, we'd love to
Yes.
hear from you.
Okay. I think just as I said before, you know, uh, when I started composing, I always found the conflict, between Western music and the Chinese music, and because the Chinese music is in my blood, and the Western music is something I acquired, but I really adore. Okay, so then how to reconcile the differences that took very very long time to gradually try to to be resolved. Yeah, that's my experience.
When I was in China, study at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, right? And during that time, it was really just uh, what do you call it? The Cultural Revolution ended, then the really open. And when I took the Chinese folk song, classes, I thought it was very uncouth, unsophisticated. I always love, I born in Shanghai and just love the Western sound. But when I came to United States, this country, I went to UCLA. The Elaine Barkin, my professor said, "Oh, you should just rediscover the Chinese heritage." Since then, I'm really started interested, finding my own voices. I try to like combine the Chinese, especially the melodic part, because I think the Chinese music it is simple pentatonic, right? And but it add a lot embellished tones, bending, and modality. But I always had open-minded. I open mind to every kinds of music.
Your piece is practically a love letter to China.
Oh, thank you, thank
It's
you.
very,
Yeah.
it's lovely and wistful and beautiful.
See.
Um, Wang Lu, what are your thoughts about this?
So I grew up in mainland China in the 80s and 90s. I started play the piano like most kids in my generation around very early age, 5 or 6. But I also grew up in the environment with a lot of popular music from Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan. And my grandmother's a big Qin opera fanatic. She's singing all the time. My dad used to be a Beijing opera professional, and they would ask me to play, things like 炸红头绳 from 白毛女 on the piano when I was like 6. Can you play that? You can play that. So it's a mixed cultural hodgepodge. Now I'm looking back, only I realize it's a process of urbanization and modernization that I lived through. And in terms of pedagogical influence, I think the conservatory prep school and the conservatory took a lot of the training methods and textbook from Russian pedagogy. So of course that's into my training naturally. Um, After I came to America 15 years ago, um, I established a new relationship with my culture, gradually changing. And in one way, I realized more of the the environmental sound and urban noise, and also I find the connection between improvised music, American jazz, and Chinese opera, like precisely Qinqiang opera, the kind of intensity and the more of controlled improvisation. It was actually interesting because my dad was a professional for over 10 years, but what he learned first was revolutionary modern model opera from the Cultural Revolution, and then he learned the old repertoire. So my knowledge was also like the model opera first. I could sing a lot of those, and then the lao xi, without knowing anything, I could just hum and memorize a lot of those.
Mhm.
So it's really a mixture, not necessarily in the correct order of things. If you want to teach someone, the history, yeah.
So I was born in the United States. My parents live in Taiwan right now. They grew up in Taiwan and met each other in the United States, and that's where my brother and I were born. And I grew up in Blacksburg, Virginia, a small town in Virginia, where really it was pretty isolated from anything to do with the Chinese culture, aside from what happened in my own household and a couple families close by. Growing up, I always felt like I was neither Chinese or American, but I belonged in some type of culture that was in between. So it sort of navigating what both experiences were, and I didn't really have words for it. When I was in fifth grade, I went back to Taiwan when my father took a sabbatical. And in that year, I felt very displaced, but my parents signed me up to take lessons on dizi, the Chinese flute, the bamboo flute. And I loved it. And even though at that point I had already started playing the piano and learned how to play piano for 5 or 6 years, and I was really just starting to learn how to play the dizi, that whole experience really gave me a sense of belonging because it was music, but it also gave me a whole other context to consider. Then I saw that there was a type of music that came from a completely different lineage than what I was learning on the piano. I learned a different instrumental family altogether, and also just a completely different notation. So even though it was all very basic, in many ways it was the experience that gave me a little bit of context to what I was already learning, and in many ways it shifted the way I saw the piano. And the piano was just one instrument, not a main instrument, but actually a Western instrument. And the dizi was another kind of instrument. I can't really say exactly, how these different parts of my identity have affected my music. I think all different parts of ourselves and our experiences make its way into our output. But I do feel that my experience being Chinese American is deepening now that my parents have gone back to Taiwan, moved back to Taiwan, and I'm rediscovering what my cultural lineage and cultural heritage is with my visits going back as an adult.
I was born into an artistic family. So my mother is a vocal teacher. So from childhood, I heard a lot of leader French art song and Western operas. I'm not familiar with Chinese traditional music. But when I went to the countryside, so I have the chance to touch base of the traditional music. Especially, I worked with a song and dance company for years, and also at the Central Conservatory, we were trained the traditional music systematically. So we learned folk songs, 说唱, traditional instrument ensemble, and then I started to interested into the Chinese traditional music. But even when I arrived in New York and studied with Professor Zhou and Zhong, Professor Zhou always said, you Chinese students just never learned Chinese traditional music and ancient culture. So he feel we still need to study into it. Now I think I am working on my own music, mostly based on the traditional Chinese culture, from the inspiration from poetry, from painting, literature, and calligraphy. So I felt some young composers today they don't really pay attention to traditional music in China. It's very valuable to learn. And also, if you read the music, they expect something from China. Even in my opera, they force me to use the Chinese traditional instruments like erhu and xun, dizi. I don't really have the gap.
Lei Liang, who also born in China, but in 1972. And Lei, you've talked about you grew up listening to the Beatles.
How did you know about that? I haven't talked about that for a long time. You're right. I listened to the Beatles, before I could speak English. I love their songs. So my classmates and I used to sing a lot of Beatles when we were in middle school, and without knowing what the songs were about. Back in China, when I was growing up in Beijing, I was so eager to listen to works by my predecessors, including Professor Zhou Long and Ganru 先生's works, and of course Zhou Wenzhong 先生, and the Beatles and all of that, But it's only after I left China, came to America, I think the story has changed for me. I was 17 years old, high school student, and I think what I discovered that's most important to me after I left China was that in America, I discovered China for myself.
Yeah, me too.
And that's something that I must give credit to, my upbringing, my parents. I did grow up in a kind of a unusual place, the Research Institute of Music of the Chinese Academy of Arts. And so we live in this dormitory right next to the institute. You could describe this place as kind of a musicological beehive. There's all these scholars who specialize in different regional opera, school chin music, aesthetics, all these things. We're all neighbors, and I grew up in that neighborhood, in that building until I was 17. But of course, when I was growing up, my mind was all like looking for, again, the title of this piece that Gloria, you're playing called My Windows. I was always looking for something that can open up for self-discovery. So I was more excited to learn the new music. But once I left China, I started to rediscover what it really meant to be growing up in Beijing, and those things that I wasn't conscious, but they're really, really inspiring. This virtual background I'm hanging, this is a detail of a Chinese landscape painting that I, artists who inspired me since my first years in college. This is the kind of artist that I discovered in America, because the first painting by this artist, Hong Minghong, I saw it in Soho Guggenheim. It took me, a couple of decades to study this artist and created this project. What you're seeing here in the background is one of the 1,600 details that we got out of one little album leaf by this artist. And I get excited because I think each one of those over 1,000 paintings is a beautiful painting in itself. And it's the kind of thing that I could only afford to understand and appreciate after I left China. So this is kind of a journey looking for home, discovering what home is, and it's possible only because I left home.
I grew up in New Jersey, playing piano and clarinet. My parents are from Taiwan, and I grew up speaking Chinese at home. And I think my experience of Chinese culture in general growing up was mostly through Saturday Chinese language classes and, the cultural classes where you take calligraphy or chess, like sword dancing or whatever we could learn. But I didn't really have a lot of opportunities to learn about Chinese music specifically until college. So I started learning guzheng when I was at Stanford, and then at UCSD, I was able to take a Chinese music class actually with Lei Liang, with Professor Liang, and also music of Asia and Oceania. And there was another grad student there, Alex Khalil, who was teaching guqing, and that was the instrument that I found a really closer connection to, like a deeper resonance in terms of the culture and the timbral subtlety and the sense of space and just the intimacy of listening that I really wanted to kind of stick with and explore a little further. So I went to Hangzhou in 2012 on a Fulbright to study that a little bit more. And it's kind of aesthetically, I think it's worked its way into my music generally more deeply than maybe some other aspects of Chinese music. But maybe it's not exactly representative of the piece that for you, Gloria, because it's a more martial piece because it's based on martial arts and like kind of low culture, like this Hong Kong action movie that's very dramatic and kind of showy and virtuosic.
It's very interesting hearing Carolyn's background because I think we share a lot in common. I was born and grew up in San Francisco, spoke Chinese at home with my parents, who also came from Taiwan and Hong Kong. And I felt like, this kind of dual existence, both, between home and then outside of home at school, and also in my musical life. And it wasn't until college when I really started to start thinking a little bit more deeply about my potential roots in Chinese music. I took a course with the ethnomusicologist Su Zheng, who teaches at Wesleyan. So I learned a lot because I wanted to do an operatic adaptation of Lu Xun's True Story of A-Q. And I wanted to write for traditional Chinese instruments, and it was the first time I'd ever attempted anything like that. So I really had to learn about these traditions from the ground up. I didn't expect to use any very concrete materials from traditional music because I just didn't have the time to absorb it. It wasn't actually part of my musical upbringing. And I think that's been the case with whenever I've written for traditional Chinese instruments. There's a sense that of being very respectful to the tradition and wanting to learn as much as I can, but in the end, I don't have the kind of familiarity and maybe the baggage as well with the traditions. And in that sense, I'm kind of free to explore in my own way and maybe think about things more thinking about the instruments with less, specific cultural connotations. So, it wasn't until really that I graduate school and meeting Wang Lu and getting more immersed in Chinese music and making trips to China almost on a yearly basis that I really was able to appreciate so much more about this music and how vast it was and how many different traditions and sub-traditions. We kind of think of Chinese music as under this like monolithic umbrella, but that's hardly the case. It's just endlessly fascinating. And being in contact with Zhou Wenzong as well, and finding and really being inspired by his example of being so invested in the traditional arts, but at the same time seeing the cross-cultural connections between, for instance, traditional painting, brush painting, but also modernist techniques, and tying these various traditions together with 20th century Western modernism and Varese, and kind of having this worldly cosmopolitan outlook towards music making. I think that was and continues to be a real influence in how I approach things.